Welcome to another episode of Primility Primer, our morning reminder of the power of balancing pride and humility as we go about our daily lives. This is episode number 56. I am your host, Jared Morris. All right, real quick. What is your biggest strength and what is your biggest weakness? I'll give you a short moment to consider and answer. Okay, you got it? Biggest strength, biggest weakness. You have those in your head. Now, was one of them easier to answer than the other? Was it perhaps easier to define your biggest strength? Was it perhaps more difficult to define your biggest weakness or vice versa? The reason I ask this is because my friend, Jonny Nastor, who is my co-host on the Showrunner podcast, he runs a site called Hack the Entrepreneur, also the podcast Hack the Entrepreneur, and he sends out a Sunday newsletter. And his newsletter this Sunday talked about strengths and weaknesses. And it talked about one of the biggest lessons that he has learned from interviewing over 140 successful entrepreneurs on Hack the Entrepreneur. And that is that each of the entrepreneurs that he has interviewed has given a different answer to his main first question, which is, what is one thing you do that nobody else does that has really contributed to your success? And this ability to define these strengths in his mind has really been helpful for these folks' success. But he says that another observation that he's made is that for most of us, we are able to define our strengths very well, but we struggle sometimes when it comes to defining our weaknesses. And instead of me explaining this, let me use Jonny's words as he explained it. So he says that it's become apparent that most of us can define our strengths a lot better than we can define our weaknesses. This makes sense, but it also shows a lack of self-awareness that needs to be honed. The people that can define their strengths as well as their weaknesses are the ones most likely to be kicking ass in their business. This is almost unanimous across the 140 plus entrepreneurs that I have interviewed. So it's not very hard to pull this into a prime context, right? In Jonny's experience, what he's saying is that most of us are pretty good at the pride part, defining what we're good at, defining our strengths. But we tend to struggle with the humility part, really understanding what we may not be so good at, what maybe we need to read about more or learn about more or take a class about or partner an area that we may want to part with someone who is strong in that area to help compensate for our weakness. And this self-awareness that Jonny's talking about, this understanding of both our strengths and our weaknesses, that's exactly what we're trying to develop here at Primility, because that self-awareness, really understanding our strengths, really understanding what our weaknesses are, will help us make the next positive decisions so that we move forward in a good way. And so at the end of his email, he asks these two questions. What is one thing that you do that you feel has been the biggest contributor to your successes so far? And then can you tell me something that you're not good at? And he's saying that you're not good at in your business, but if you don't have a business, tell me something that is holding you back from starting. And here's the interesting thing about strengths and weaknesses that I have found, which is that a lot of times our biggest strength can also be our biggest weakness. And this is another area where the bigger concept of primility, the bigger concept of balance, right, of not ever letting ourselves get pulled too far in one direction, really becomes important. And I had an old boss back when I lived in Miami who used to tell me this all the time. Your biggest strength can be your biggest weakness, and you've really got to watch out for that. And so the way that I answered these questions, these two questions to Jonny, because as soon as I read his email, I hit reply, answered the questions. So to the first question about what is the one thing I've done that has helped me contribute to success, it's been start. Basically indulge in my enthusiasm and just start things without asking questions. I didn't really, I didn't ask too many questions before I started these Primility Primers, and here we are a couple months later on episode 56. I didn't ask a whole lot of questions. Am I qualified to run a post-game show for Indiana basketball? Any of that, I just started. And a lot of projects that have become long-term projects that I'm really proud of, really excited about, happen simply because I just started, because I'm able to get a lot of enthusiasm about an idea and get going with it and build early momentum. I think that's one of my biggest strengths. But as I sat there to answer the second question, what I realized is that is also my biggest weakness, because a lot of times I have started things and haven't followed through on them. Obviously, Primility is not one. Assembly of Call is not one. Those are still standing. But there is also a long wake of projects that have been started and abandoned. And that same enthusiasm that can be so powerful at starting something, at beginning a project and really getting into it, can also cause me, if I'm not careful, to lose focus and take my eye off the ball, because the next shiny object comes and now I'm excited over here and enthusiastic over here about starting something. And that's something that I've gained a lot of self-awareness about over time, simply by really trying to step back and analyze when I've succeeded, when I've failed. And a lot of times it's the same element of myself that's driving both the success and the failure. And it's really about, again, understanding what they are, understanding the strength, understanding the weakness, and then really trying to balance them. And in this case, when you find that a strength is also a weakness, it's about doing what we talk about doing here on these Primility Primers every weekday morning, which is really finding that balance. Find that sweet spot in the middle, whether it's pride and humility, whatever it is, find that sweet spot in the middle to where you're not out on one of the extremes, because typically that tends to not be so good. And so what I want to turn around and ask you today, the question I want to ask you is, what is your biggest strength? What is your biggest weakness? I asked you that question at the beginning, and now I'd love to know what the answer is. I'd love for you to email me, jared@primility.com, or go to primility.com/show/056 and put the answer there in the comments. And in fact, I would answer these two. I would answer it in the context of the questions that Jonny asked, and I've put them on the show notes. Again, what is the one thing you do that you feel has been the biggest contributor to your success? And then can you tell me something that you're not so good at? And I think it'll be instructive as you think about those questions. Is one easier or harder than the other? Because maybe for you, it's really easy to define your weaknesses, and those pop up real quick, and you struggle to define your strengths. Well, in that case, maybe you're falling more on the side of the humility than the pride, and we need to pull you back into balance over there. And so I think that's what to watch out for, is as you answer these two questions, which one comes to you easier? And do you end up doing what I did and finding that what you identify as your greatest strength is immediately what you identify as your greatest weakness? I think it'll be really interesting. I'd love to see your answers. I will forward them to Jonny as well. And that's my last call to action for you today, is go to hacktheentrepreneur.com and get on Jonny's email list, because his Sunday newsletter, it's short like mine is. It's typically 250, 300 words, if that. I highly recommend it. There's always some kind of useful tip that you can take and apply to your next week that ends up being really helpful. So highly recommend that as well. All right. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Primility Primer. We'll be back tomorrow with episode number 57 live at primility.com/live at 6:30 Central Time, as we are every weekday. I look forward to speaking with you then. Thank you for being here today. Until we talk tomorrow, stay cognizant of your pride and humility. I'll talk to you soon. Wrist bump.